Well, the Prime Minister was asked about this within the last half hour. Was the UK being generous enough?
We're processing thousands right now, and we will continue to make sure that we have a very, very generous approach. What we won't do, let me be very clear, what we won't do is have a system where people can come into the UK without any checks or any controls at all. I don't think that is the right approach.
Let's bring into the conversation John Penrose, who's MP for Weston-super-Mare. Mr Penrose, good afternoon to you. Welcome. Do you think the UK is doing enough?
I think we're doing a huge amount, but I think that the Prime Minister is right that we will need to make sure that the arrangements which have already been announced for all the refugees, a series of different corridors and kinds of eligibility, which ought to admit hundreds of thousands by the government's own figures, and that clearly needs to work in practice, not just on paper. Because in theory won't get you across a border. So
no.
Great that we've got the thing in principle, but we actually need to make it happen. And that I think there will be questions being asked, I'm sure, today in Westminster to make sure that that is moving much faster.
And also in Westminster, there is this whole question about sanctions taken against Russia in the House of Commons, and in particular, whether Russians living in the UK, particularly those who appear to have an awful lot of wealth which isn't easily explained, are we taking action against those individuals in a swift and proper manner, in your view?
Well, we've done a chunk, and we've certainly helped to be. We've been in the lead on the sort of international coordination of the economic response, which you were just talking about in your. Mr. Blinken was talking about from the US and how that's working. So again, really good start, and it's a really big but. What we've got to be able to do here is to find the money. We've got to be able to follow the money for the Russians, as you say, many of whom are actually fleeing from Putin's regime. That's why they've come to London. But the small number who are cronies of Putin's regime and who are here with dirty money, you've got to be able to follow that money, because you can't sanction cash if you don't know where it is. You've got to be able to find it. And so therefore, there's a really important bill going through Parliament today as emergency legislation, which will allow us to follow the money, will close some really important loopholes in being able to track it down. And that should mean, I hope, that our sanctioning efforts will be much better targeted, and I hope we'll be able to move up another gear or two as a result.
And I think there are dozens of amendments being posed about all this, aren't there? I don't know if you've seen the latest draft on this. One issue which I think...
Several of them have got my name on them, yes. Keep going.
Well, there you go. So you're helping rewrite this stuff, which is why it's good to talk to you. To address the point raised by Sir Keir Starmer, and we played a clip from him about half an hour ago, they seem to feel that if you're going to serve notice on somebody, right, we think you've got unexplained wealth, or we don't know where your money's coming from, or whatever, the warning at the moment seems to be about 18 months or 6 months. Sir Keir saying it should be 28 days at the most. Do you agree with that?
I think he's half right, because it's absolutely right to say that you can't just allow all these oligarchs, many of whom have got huge amounts of money and therefore can employ the very, very best lawyers on the planet. You can't give them a huge run-up to get their money out of the country. You've got to make sure you're freezing it in place. So we've got to make sure that that being able to identify the cash and freezing it happens ideally tomorrow, not in 28 days, not in 18 months. There are some practical problems with that in terms of tracking it down and making sure that you've got all the data you need in order to do it accurately, and you're not picking on the wrong things which belong to blameless people. But actually, I think there's probably a technocratic fix, which I won't bore your listeners with this afternoon. But there is probably a technocratic fix which will allow us to do it starting pretty much immediately, and basically say you can't sell your glossy Mayfair penthouse flat or whatever it is that they've got their money stashed in, unless you can reveal your identity to the land registry, to officials, and they can basically block it. If once you've revealed your identity, it turns out that you're one of the people who's sanctioned. At that point, they can say, well, you can't sell it. I'm terribly sorry. Well, in fact, we're not sorry at all. You can't sell it, and it's now part of the sanctions list. Thanks very much. So I think there's an answer.
You think you're
not quite the one which the Labour Party is suggesting.
Okay, so you're optimistic we could make progress on that in this.
Yeah.
There is the usual thing is, of course, when law is made in such speed, and one understands the intent here, but if laws made in haste often prove to be rather poor law, do you think that these rather emotionally charged circumstances might create a rather poor bit of legislation, either with holes in or with unintended consequences?
That's always a risk, but usually when you've got something which is going through as an emergency piece of legislation, which is what's happening today, normally it only goes through if all sides of the aisle, if all the different political parties right the way across the political spectrum all agree. And at that point, if everybody agrees on it, it doesn't mean to say that it's always going to be perfect, but it does reduce the scope for dropping the ball in some way which people didn't.
And I suppose there's always the option to amend things at a later date, isn't it? But John, just a practical thing. I don't know if any of the oligarchs keep a very big boat or luxury yacht. And we've seen the Italian authorities moved in, I think, on one vessel almost immediately last week. And yet we might know or suspect that, I don't know, it might not be a vessel, I suppose. It might be a huge block of flats in the heart of Mayfair or something. The UK authorities haven't been able to move with such nimbleness. Do you think that post this legislation they might be able to act much quicker?
Well, that's the aim of the legislation. The difficulty with, for example, blocks of flats in London is that you can hold them still with a shell company that doesn't show the real owner's name. It can be the XYZ corporation incorporated in a foreign country. And what the legislation this afternoon is supposed to do is to strip that away and say, no, you can't hold things through shell companies anymore. You've got to be able to trace it back to someone with a pulse. And at that point, when you can trace it back to someone with a pulse, then you can match them up against the list of the sanctions. You can say, right, that belongs to so-and-so who's already on our sanctions list, and therefore we know it's theirs, and we can sanction it, and we can include it. That's the missing bit. That's why this is so important to do it fast.
If you've got just 30 seconds, let me just read you a statement from the Home Office. You may have seen this because you get these things a bit earlier than we do. But they've just said this. Last week, we announced a new sponsorship route which will allow Ukrainians with no family ties to the UK to be sponsored to come to the UK. This is alongside our Ukraine Family Scheme, which has already seen thousands of people apply, as well as changes to visas so that people can stay in the UK safely. The routes we have put in place follow extensive engagement with Ukrainian partners. This is a rapidly moving and complex picture, and as the situation develops, we will continue to keep our support under constant review. Now, I think that statement was partially in response to the idea that the Home Secretary was saying there are about 3 different channels or maybe a 4th one or something fresh. That's not the case, is it? It's just the existing paths are being greased a little or the machinery is being oiled a little.
Right. I think both those two paths, the family path and the humanitarian path, are both new in the last week or two, and they between them should add up, in theory, to the hundreds of thousands that we were talking about at the start of this conversation. The problem with it is, it isn't that we need another path which would work in theory. What we need to do is to make those two, which ought to be plenty, work in practice. And there's a big difference, as you'll appreciate, between hundreds of thousands of people in theory and 50 so far in practice. That's the thing that I think we've got to fix.